Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malday, Associate Director at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In this week's episode, BPC Senior Advisor Theresa Cardinal Brown delves into the history and reality of how immigrants vote in the United States. Theresa is joined by Rachel Orey, Director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Elections Project, to discuss current legislation that defines the eligibility for voting and protects against non-citizen voting. Then, Theresa welcomes Irene Bloemraad, professor at the University of British Columbia and co-director of the Center for Migration Studies, to dive into the history of different immigrant groups to the United States and how they exercise their voting rights when they become citizens. So stay tuned.
The U.S. presidential election is coming, or will have already come by the time you're listening to our podcast. A month ago in our podcast, we discussed anticipated differences and similarities in immigration policy under both Harris's and Trump's administrations, and very soon we will know who is taking the White House for the next 4 years and which party will control Congress. So while we are on this final stretch of this election season in which immigration has featured prominently as a campaign issue, we decided we needed to examine one of the persistent issues that has arisen, that of non-citizen voting. Former President Donald Trump and many in the Republican Party have expressed concern about what they view as a large issue of non-citizens voting in U.S. federal elections. This has led to controversy and many fact checks. However, we have great resources here at the Bipartisan Policy Center in our bipartisan elections team, and we want to break down this question, where it comes from, and help our audience better understand who is eligible to vote in the United States and how our election system determines whether someone is eligible to vote and whether immigrants have impacted the elections in the past. So our first guest today is Rachel Orey, the director of the Bipartisan Policy Center Elections Project, where they are responsible for BPC's election administration policy and professionalization efforts. Rachel's research focuses on evidence-based and data-driven reforms that create secure, accessible, and trustworthy elections. Rachel has served as an expert source for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Politico, VoteBeat, and more. They regularly publish op-eds on state election issues and have represented BPC in speaking engagements at dozens of state and national conferences. Prior to joining the BPC, they supported research efforts at the Brookings Institution on topics of congressional oversight, election administration, and the Federal Reserve. So welcome to the podcast, Rachel.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with the basics. Who can vote in these presidential elections?
Unfortunately, in elections, the basics are never as basic as they seem. But generally speaking, you can vote in a presidential election if you are a U.S. citizen, if you meet your state's residency requirements, if you are 18 years or older before or on election day, and if you are registered to vote in your state by your state's voter registration deadline. But I think the key piece for this conversation is that you can vote in a presidential election only if you are a U.S. citizen.
Right. So let's talk about this. Is every 4 years we elect the president. Every 2 years we have votes for Congress. Do all of these elections have the same rules on voting? And what about state and local elections? Are there any differences there?
There are a couple key differences. So, when it comes to federal elections, we're thinking about elections for members of the US Congress or for president. Those are cases where non citizens are explicitly prohibited from voting in those elections. So, you have to be a citizen to vote in the presidential election or any federal election. There are exceptions, however, when it comes to local elections. So, 3 states in Washington, D.C. have municipalities that allow non citizens to vote in certain local elections. There is no state that currently allows non-citizens to vote in statewide elections. So we typically see, small municipalities here and there that allow non-citizens to vote. Right now we have San Francisco, Oakland, and a couple cities in Maryland and Vermont. DC recently enacted a new law allowing non-citizens to vote in non-federal elections as well.
So let's talk about those differences. How do local election authorities differentiate who can vote in which election if they're running multiple elections sometimes at the same time or maybe not?
Yeah, so they would have an indication on their voter rolls, their kind of list of registered and eligible voters, indicating whether or not that individual is permitted to vote in a federal election. I think Arizona is kind of an interesting flip case on this because they require documentary proof of citizenship, which I think is something we're going to talk a little bit more about later. So they actually have two separate voter registration forms and two separate lists of voters, one for voters that are only allowed to participate in federal elections, and one for voters who can participate in local and state elections as well. So that's an example of how an election office might maintain separate lists for voters that are eligible for different types of elections. I think another option would just be some kind of designation on a voter's entry in a voter roll indicating what elections they're eligible to vote in. Similar to how if you're voting in one precinct and you have a certain thing on your ballot, you can't vote in this a different race in your neighboring precinct that doesn't have that race on the ballot.
Right. They publish different ballots for different sets of offices. So let's talk about, you said it's not legal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. What is the legislation that protects elections from non-citizen voting? What is the statute there? And what's the history of that legislation?
So there are two big pieces of federal law governing non-citizen voting. The first is the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. Quite a mouthful. It's from 1996, and it explicitly prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections. So, to be very clear, it is not legal in any state for a non-citizen to cast a ballot in a federal election. We have one more piece of federal legislation there called the National Voter Registration Act, and that's from 1993. And that requires states to use a common voter registration form, which includes an attestation under penalty of perjury that the applicant is a US citizen. So, in other words, in order to register to vote, you have to indicate whether you are a citizen. And that is signed under penalty of perjury, and you risk imprisonment, fines if you mislead the election official on whether or not you are eligible and a citizen.
Yeah. And those of our listeners who are familiar with immigration law will recognize that long name as the IRA legislation of 1996. And in that legislation, not only did it make non citizen voting illegal, but it created immigration penalties for somebody who would vote in a federal election. So, in addition to civil criminal penalties, they can have immigration penalties as well. And we can talk about that. But this year, we've obviously seen a lot of discussion by candidates and in the media regarding ineligible immigrants voting and the impact they could have on a tight election. So, where do you think this concern comes from? And do we have any evidence that ineligible immigrants voting in the past? And if so, what did that look like? Did it have any impact on any elections?
So, we have never seen any evidence of comprehensive voting by non citizens. Illegal voting, including that by non citizens, is routinely investigated and prosecuted by authorities in the state. And there's no evidence that non citizen voting has ever been significant enough to impact an election's outcome. That's not to say that it's never happened. Rather, it just happens in such small numbers that it hasn't impacted the ultimate outcome or integrity of an election. So, BPC analysis, we looked at the Heritage Foundation's election fraud cases database. They have this whole database of different instances of election fraud over the last about 25 years. And we scraped that entire database and categorized any instance in which it included some keywords related to non citizen voting. And we only found 77 cases of non citizens voting between 1999 and 2023. So if you think about the millions and millions of ballots that have been cast in those 24 years, this is a minuscule, like 0.0001 probably percent of the ballots that have been cast were cast by non-citizens. So not impacting the election's outcome. And these are all individuals that were caught and prosecuted for their actions. Additionally, a study conducted by the Brennan Center for Justice analyzed 23.5 million votes across 42 jurisdictions in 2016 and found only 30 instances of non citizens casting votes. So, very rare. We find that in addition to the legal penalties for non citizen voting, deterrence is a really important factor. We think that if someone is in the United States, trying to find a legal path to citizenship, they aren't going to risk that path in order to register or cast a ballot.
Yeah. So let's talk about, I mean, still, even a small number. What do elections officials do to try to prevent this from happening? You mentioned Arizona has a law that requires documentary evidence of citizenship, at least for non-federal elections. What are the different means and methods that elections officials use to try to make sure that they are only eligible voters on the rolls?
Yeah, it's a great question. And elections are administered differently in different states around the country. So there's no one single answer. But generally speaking, there are a couple things that are done. One of the primary methods is just what I mentioned earlier with that kind of checkbox on the voter registration form, in which you have to attest that you're a citizen in order to register to vote. So that's built into the process, one deterrence mechanism, and one way to filter out voter registration rolls from anyone who doesn't say that they're a citizen proactively. Additionally, there are documentation requirements, some of which indicate citizenship and some that don't, but it's a way of verifying that the voter says who they say they are. So in Colorado, for example, the DMV, or their Department of Motor Vehicles, shares information on a daily basis with the state election office. That includes which documentation a voter has provided when they signed up to get a driver's license or a state ID. And in almost all combinations of, they have to provide two types of documentation. In almost all combinations of different types of documentation provided, the state can determine whether someone is a citizen based on the documentation they provided. So if someone provides a birth certificate, for example, that might indicate whether someone is a citizen. If for whatever reason the state isn't able to determine citizenship based on documentation provided, they could then kind of flag that case for further examination. So it sometimes happens on a case by case basis. And then there are some kind of broader systematic processes that can help identify and address citizenship eligibility.
Right. So this summer, you, together with our BPC colleague, Executive Director of the Democracy Program, Matthew Weil, and intern Julianne Lampert, published an explainer of something called the SAVE Act. So this is a bill that's been introduced in Congress that would ostensibly strengthen the protections against non-citizen voting. Could you tell us more about this proposed bill and what you all wrote in your review of it?
Yeah, so the SAVE Act, the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, it requires voters to provide documentary proof of citizenship at the time of registration. Our key thought about this bill is that citizenship, one, is already a requirement to vote, but it can be really difficult to prove. And because we know that voting and registration by non citizens is not happening at scale, it's not really a problem. This bill is trying to solve a problem that really doesn't exist. And in doing so, it risks creating additional burdens and restrictions for otherwise eligible voters. And so, it could be better implemented, could be better conceived. I think there are ways that we can improve voter registration and list maintenance in this country that don't involve creating additional restrictions or additional burdens on eligible voters. One thing I really like about this bill is that it gives election officials easier access to a federal database, also called the SAVE database, maintained by USCIS, in which election officials would be able to submit data in bulk about potential voters and receive information back about whether those individuals have naturalized. So that's kind of one thing where it's like better data availability is a good thing, period. But requiring additional documentation at the point of registration might risk disenfranchising eligible citizens.
Yeah. And I think it's worth just explaining to our listeners who may not know what kinds of documentation citizens may have. For example, if you've never applied for a US passport, you may never have had to prove your US citizenship at any point in your life if you don't travel outside the country. As you said, when you register to vote, you check a box unless you're required to prove something. For most US citizens, their proof of citizenship is their birth certificate showing that they were born in the United States. But there have been instances where, in South Texas, for example, Mexican mothers would cross the border, or doctors in South Texas would go into Mexico and then would issue a Texas birth certificate. And some of those are now being questioned. So we don't have a national ID card in the United States like many other countries do. There are lots of different ways of proving citizenship. A social security card may or may not prove citizenship because certain non-immigrants can get, or non-citizens can get social security cards as well. I think it's just worth explaining that there's not a single document that every U.S. citizen would have, that, oh, it's easy for me to prove. And I think that's one of the concerns that a lot of people have with these kind of requirements, is that it's not that easy to prove citizenship in some cases, correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, right? If we all had this documentation kind of ready on hand, then of course, right? It makes sense to have it be a requirement, but the unfortunate reality is that many Americans don't.
Yeah, we don't. You mentioned that the SAVE Act might have had unintended consequences for eligible citizens, and one of the more vulnerable groups that you mentioned in there is homeless citizens who are eligible to vote, but probably have lots of barriers to doing so. How does it work for people who don't have a fixed residence to be able to vote in elections today, and how could some of those folks have their voting rights better secured?
Yeah, to answer this question, I'm going to point back to the Arizona example I mentioned briefly earlier, where they have a federal only list. So Arizona is one of the only states, or the only state that currently enforces a law requiring documentary proof of citizenship to vote, which is essentially what the SAVE Act would do. And so any individual who hasn't provided documentary proof of citizenship is placed on what's called this federal only list, meaning they can only vote in federal elections.
So I want to pause you right there because I want to ask a question. Is that because right now federal law does not allow them to require that proof of citizenship, but for
Yes.
state law it does? Is that why there's a difference there?
Yes. So in 2013, the Supreme Court ruled that under the Voting Rights Act, Arizona had to let these voters vote in federal elections.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. And so the state kind of created the system as a way to get around and maintain the requirement for state and local elections. But Vote Beat, which is a nonprofit newsroom kind of focused on election administration and voting issues, did some analysis of who was on this federal only list, who was on this list of people who have not provided documentary proof of citizenship. What they found was that federal only voters tend to be concentrated in a couple places. One, they tend to be concentrated on college campuses. This makes a lot of sense. Students who are moving around probably don't have easy access to documentary proof of citizenship. The second place that they found them to be concentrated was in homeless shelters. So these are individuals experiencing homelessness who, makes a lot of sense that they wouldn't have any kind of identity documentation at hand, let alone their birth certificate or passport. So this is one instance in which we see a group of, two populations of people who would pretty quickly be impacted by any kind of documentary proof of citizenship requirement. When it comes to things that we can do to better serve individuals experiencing homelessness, I like to, well, I guess to answer the first part of your question, they can provide addresses such as a shelter, even if they don't live there, when registering to vote. So they at least have some kind of mailing address or location on file. They can also sometimes just provide an intersection of somewhere where they sleep to the election office. So they have some kind of location on file there. I love this example from Denver. So the Denver Clerk and Recorder's Office every Monday hosts a mutual aid Monday and has a homeless resource drive outside of the city building, and they'll offer things like food and bedding and other resources, and then they have someone from the elections office there with information about how to register and vote for this population. So I think that's a really wonderful example of an election office going out of their way to engage this population and make sure that they have the same right to cast their ballot as every other citizen in this country.
Yeah. So I'm going to give a plug to our listeners. Anything you want to know about how elections are administered in this country, the differences at different localities and states, best practices, I urge you to go to the Bipartisan Policy Center website and look up our Democracy and Elections Project. They have so many resources and explainers on so many things. Rachel, most of our audience who listen to this podcast probably will listen after they've already voted because it's going to be released on election day. But any last thoughts or advice to them from you or the BPC Elections Project on what to expect after the election and how Americans can be confident the election has been secure and trustworthy?
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying we just fielded a survey of registered voters nationally, and we found that confidence that votes will be counted as intended has actually gone up by about 7 percentage points since December of last year. So that has me feeling pretty good going into, for me, the election is next week. And we saw that about 80% of voters nationwide are confident that votes will be counted as intended. So again, there's good news out there, I promise. But if it's, if you're right now in that period after the election, a couple things that I'll flag. I think one, results might take longer than usual, particularly if it's a really close race. I think that's the thing that people miss. They're like, well, why are votes taking so long to be counted? Even if votes are being counted and processed as usual, if the margin is really thin, that means you need every single ballot processed in order to know who the winner is. And so that's why we might see longer waits for results after Election Day. I also think it's important to remember that the results you see on election night are always unofficial, as election officials kind of process and validate those results. And that's an important security measure. It's part of why we have such trustworthy elections, because election officials take the time they need to make sure that every ballot cast should have been cast and was counted as intended. The other thing I might flag is that we do expect extensive litigation in the weeks that follow the election, kind of regardless of who the projected winner is. So I would just urge patience. I know it's hard to keep track of every single case that's filed, and we know those cases are coming, and we trust the courts to resolve those disputes fairly, and just hope that voters can take a step back and experience some calm as we bear through any contests that happen.
Yeah, there'll be lots of things flying around, but as we used to say at Department of Homeland Security, the information you get in the immediacy of an event is almost always going to be incomplete and oftentimes just wrong. And I think maybe we can take a lesson from that for the election this year. What you hear on election night, definitely going to be incomplete, may or may not be correct when we get to the end of the process. So just be patient and we will know for sure. Rachel, thank you so much. Thank you to you and everyone on our elections project for all the work that you have done and are doing. And thanks so much for joining us on This Week in Immigration.
Likewise, thank you.
We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll talk with Professor Irene Bloemraad, co-director of the Migration Studies at the University of British Columbia. So stay tuned. I am delighted to welcome our next guest, Irene Bloemraad, who is professor at the University of British Columbia and co-director of the Center for Migration Studies there. In her own words, Irene studies how immigrants become incorporated into political communities and the consequences of migration on politics and the understanding of membership. Her research stands at the intersection of migration studies and political sociology, with a strong interdisciplinary and international scope. She recently joined the University of British Columbia as the inaugural President's Excellence Chair in Global Migration, with a joint appointment in political science and sociology. Prior to coming to UBC, she was the chair in sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, where she also directed the Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative. So welcome to the podcast, Irene.
Thanks so much for having me, Theresa.
So today we are helping our audience to sort out how naturalized immigrants vote in the United States today and historically, and whether their voting has mattered for election results. So just before you came on, we spoke to Rachel Orey, who's with the Bipartisan Policy Center's election project, to talk about current legislation on who's eligible to vote in presidential elections on federal, state, and local levels. But you've dedicated your life to the research of the impact that immigrants have on politics. So tell us a little bit more about your research and what inspired you to delve into this topic.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So I study all aspects of immigration and politics. So this includes how immigrants engage in the political system, such as the question of whether they become citizens, why they become citizens, how quickly they become citizens, but also how immigrants participate in the electoral system, and also how immigrants engage in peaceful protest, in the spirit of iconic social movements in the United States. So any kind of intersection between immigration and politics. And then at the same time, I'm also doing research on what non-immigrant citizens think about immigration, so attitudes towards immigrants and immigration, and how immigration policy is made, as well as the consequences of those policies.
So what got you interested in that topic for starters?
So I'm an immigrant myself, and I've immigrated multiple times to multiple countries. And when I was a college student, I was an undergraduate in political science, and I didn't see any attention to immigrants as political actors in any of the standard theories or studies that we were reading. And the only thing in the political science classes was perhaps a little bit on immigrants as a target of policy or politics, like far right rhetoric against immigrants, but not immigrants as actors. And, I thought that was a problem because you see immigrants engaging in the political system. In fact, my own mother, after I moved out of the home to go to college, she ran an unsuccessful campaign to be elected to our local city council. And she'd been living in the community for years, but she still got comments on her accent. And a few people even told her that she didn't belong, go back to where you came from. And so it takes real courage to try to exercise your political voice in those circumstances. And so I really want to study those small acts of courage and how important they are. And they need to be studied.
Yeah. So we know that naturalized immigrants are eligible to vote in federal elections, but do they vote? And how do they vote? What has your research said about the participation rates of non-US born citizens or naturalized citizens in the voting process in the United States?
So I think academics like to say this, but it's true. It's really complex, right? And it's no different, I think, than if we say, well, what do women voters want, or what do Texan voters want, or what do Pennsylvanians want? Immigrants are not a monolith, just like all those other groups are not a monolith. So some of the things we know about the general population holds true among immigrants as well. So, in the general population, generally speaking, younger people vote less than older people, more educated people vote more than those with less education, those with higher incomes tend to vote more than those with lower incomes. So, all of those things are just as applicable when it comes to immigrants. Now, of course, with immigrants, there might be some additional challenges or things might work slightly differently. So, one of those is language fluency. In order to become a citizen of the United States, you have to show that you have some English ability. But politics can be pretty complex. And so you might have sufficient English ability to do the naturalization exam, to do your daily business. But it can be a little bit more complicated when it comes to politics. So then we have to look at things like, is there a robust ethnic media? Are people able to talk to others in their own language, or have some trusted community members or media figures who translate the conversations into a language they feel comfortable with? Generally speaking, as I said, higher education is correlated with being more likely to vote, but it also depends where you were educated. So if most of your education was in a different country, you might not completely understand the American system. It's super complex. A lot of Americans don't understand all of the wrinkles in the U.S. system. So sometimes that link between education and voting is a little bit different for immigrants, depending on what country they come from. And that can have a difference too. If you're coming from a country where you've previously been able to vote, a democratic country, or have you been coming from a country where you were penalized or even maybe thrown in jail for expressing political voice? Those kind of habits that you've learned from where you grew up can travel with you. So those are the big sort of
Mhm.
tendencies. And then, we can dive down into some of the details.
Sure, sure. So for those naturalized immigrants who do vote, what kinds of things motivate them to vote?
So again, a lot of things that are the same as anybody else, things around how the economy is going, what they think about healthcare, what they think about security and crime. Um, immigrants, especially those who have come more recently, are certainly looking at immigration policy if they are interested in sponsoring friends or family to come. They're going to be paying attention to that. Some people might have members of their family who are on temporary visas, H-1B visas, or maybe a temporary work permit, or they might have undocumented family members, so they're going to pay attention to that. It really depends on the group, how long they've been in the country. Generally speaking, immigrants tend to probably lean more Democrat than Republican. But again, there's lots of variation. historically, groups that have left communist countries, like Cubans and Vietnamese, have tended to support the Republican Party more because they have seen the Republican Party, especially during the Cold War, as sort of staunchly anti-communist, and they have alignment in terms of foreign policy goals. Other groups tend to vote more Democratic because they see their interests with more public benefits, more investment in things like education. There's a lot of complexity there.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of got to some of my next question. It sounds like that immigrant political participation is not homogeneous. It varies a lot. And you talked a little bit about how different immigrant groups from different countries of origin might vote differently. Could you talk a little bit about sort of that, the tendencies of, based on where they come from versus like where they settle in the United States? So if they come to a place in the United States that is more, as in our verbiage, red versus blue, would they tend to adopt some of those communities? Do you have any research that shows how those things come out?
So, absolutely, the way we vote, the way we interact with the political system is a mix of who we are, our backgrounds, our interests, and then where we live. And, again, that's no different from immigrants as non-immigrants. If you grew up in North Dakota, but you moved to California, it is possible that the way you understand politics is going to change because of that. So you certainly see, for example, communities that have settled, say, in California, voting one way, and then people from that same country of origin who go to a different state might vote slightly differently. I hesitate to make sort of really strong statements because the balance between where people land politically can be things like their own attitudes, say, around social issues. If immigrants themselves are maybe have some more traditional religious beliefs or are coming from countries where, say, openness to LGBTQ issues is not the same as some places in the United States, their social views on things like same-sex marriage, gender transitions might be more similar to US born citizens' views within the Republican Party. But at the same time, the longer they live in the United States, those views can change. Sometimes people come to the United States because their countries are not open to queer individuals. And so when they come to the United States, they might lean very much more Democratic because that's the party that they see as representing their interests. One of the things that really matters in terms of the degree to which immigrants get involved in politics is the strength of the local immigrant community. So things like the ethnic media, things like the organizations in the community. Is the community organized in faith communities? So they are going to a temple or a church on the weekends or on a Friday. What are people saying? How are they interacting? And again, this is no different than non-immigrants. But if you have a robust civic infrastructure, it is much easier for immigrants to come together and mobilize. And so when we think about immigrant communities that are very prominent in politics, I would say, if we think about Cubans in South Florida, if we think about the Vietnamese in Orange County in California, these are places where you have really thick, rich ethnic communities. And that really helps people have political voice.
Yeah, and we're starting to see more of that in recent elections. Think of the Arab American community in Michigan, for example, or the Hmong in Wisconsin. These may have been groups that settled many years ago, and now we're several generations in, but they have developed their own sort of political identity in those locations, and politicians are starting to pay attention to that. Can you talk a little bit about how politicians try to address different immigrant communities when trying to attract voters in the United States?
Sure. So the research suggests that politicians are not particularly interested in welcoming new voters into politics unless they're pretty sure where those voters are going to line up, right? Politicians just want to get
Yeah,
elected. And
right.
so if they are in a particularly safe district, They're not going to make very many efforts to encourage immigrants to vote. And so, one of the things we see is that immigrants tend to become more involved and have a better chance of even running for office themselves in districts that are at play. So, competitive districts are the places where politicians are really hustling to find every single vote. And so, there's much more openness to mobilizing immigrants in those places. And we've seen this historically. If you look back 100 years at the cities like New York and other places where immigrants really got into politics, it was the places where there was sort of a competitive edge. And then once they were part of politics, they became, just like many other groups, sort of part of the establishment. But germane to what you were asking, it really depends on whether the political parties do outreach. And in places that are safe seats, there's not very many incentives for politicians to do that. And if they're not sure where the immigrants are going to land, they're not going to make much effort to include them in politics.
That's interesting. Are the immigrant groups themselves, you mentioned sort of local civic organizations, at the end of the day, when and how do immigrants sort of get that pull to join the political discourse via actions or voting? If they're not being actively courted by the political establishment, could that in itself be a reason to get active? Like, no one's talking to me, but I have issues, so I want to get engaged. Is that one of the reasons we can see naturalized immigrants getting involved in the political process?
Absolutely. One of the things that we see in the US, and especially compared to Canada, where I am now, is that in the United States, it tends to be much more the 1.5 or the second generation that gets involved in politics. And so when we speak about immigrants and immigrant voters, what we mean is people who were born in another country, come to the United States, become naturalized citizens, and then participate in politics. The 1.5 are the kids of those immigrants who were born in another country but come at a very young age. So for all intents and purposes, they're just like everybody else who was born in the US because they go to the same schools. They've spent their entire lives in the US or most of their lives, speak English fluently. So they tend to be more active. And then especially the kids who are born in the United States, they're the ones who often, if we look at like who gets elected and who is really pushing the envelope both in electoral politics or in protest politics, it tends to be the kids of immigrants. And a lot of that has to do with when you're an immigrant, you come to the country, probably you're not fluent in English. You might know some English, but you're probably not fluent. Your first job is to get settled, to get a job, build a community, rent a house, buy a house. Your focus is really just not on politics often. And it's really the second generation that feels more comfortable, that has the skills, that has the networks. The other thing that happens in the US is politics is expensive. To run for office requires money and social networks. And so, just like politics in the US is really difficult to break into for any working class person, it's the same thing for immigrants. And then immigrants have an additional barrier because if you've been born in the country, especially if you have multiple generations who are born in the country, you might have all kinds of networks. So maybe you don't have a lot of money, but you have friends who have money who can donate to
Mhm.
you. If you're an immigrant, that's much, much harder. So for all of those reasons, generally speaking, we see that it's the kids of immigrants who are the ones who will often take the lead. It's not always the case, but
Mhm.
often. When we see the first generation becoming involved, it sometimes tends to be when there's a threat. There's a hate crime that's been committed against the community. People speak out. It's maybe around foreign policy concerns that the immigrant generation feels particularly upset about. War in their homeland, some human rights abuses that they want to speak out about, or their community is being targeted and they're trying to defend themselves and their family and friends.
Yeah. One of the things we have definitely taken note of in the United States is more immigrants and children of immigrants who are getting elected to federal office in Congress. I think we have some of the most diverse than we've had in a long time, including people who are formerly undocumented who are now members of Congress. As we become more diverse as a society, do you feel like that's going to be sort of the future political leanings. As we have a more diverse population, we're going to see more people in office who maybe weren't born in the United States or their parent or first generation.
I hope so. I mean, I think in a democracy like the United States, and especially one founded on the idea that there should be, no taxation without representation, it's part of the ethos of the United States that the governing bodies should reflect the people that they govern. So I certainly hope so. I will say again, though, that even though the US, I would say, has a very, relative to other countries, a very open naturalization system. So there are certainly barriers to becoming a US citizen. But in general, the US is relatively welcoming and open so that people who have permanent legal status can become citizens. The political system, though, especially the federal political system, has barrier after barrier after barrier. And this can be in terms of gerrymandering of districts, this can be in terms of incumbency, this can be in terms of the cost of running for office. And so for all of those reasons, the sort of like the House of Representatives and the Senate in the US is actually not that representative of immigrant diversity as compared to, say, Canada. So I really hope that we're going to see more of this. But the barriers to entry in the United States are just significant. And it's not just with immigrants. We see this in terms of female representation. We see this in terms of representation of people who don't have college degrees. US politics, especially at the federal level, is just really hard to break into.
So let's do a little comparative politics here with Canada, because you mentioned that. I mean, so a couple of things to understand. One is the United States right now, we believe that based on the last census, we are just around 14% foreign born, but Canada is much higher than that. I think you're over 20% foreign born in Canada, with many more recent immigrants. And as you mentioned, in the Parliament of Canada, probably more first generation immigrants represented there. Talk to us a little bit about what you see as differences in sort of the participation of naturalized citizens in the United States and in Canada in the political process, and what maybe might be some of the reasons for those differences that you see.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a far higher proportion of people who are foreign born in the House of Commons in Canada. And another interesting thing is it's across almost all of the major parties. So you see people who are foreign born in the Conservative Party, which is the right of center party, in the Liberal Party, the centrist party, in the NDP, which is the left of center party, and even in places such as Quebec in the more nationalist party, the Green Party. So what's interesting is that immigrants are involved in politics sort of across the political spectrum. As to why, naturalization, so acquisition of citizenship among immigrants, is higher in Canada than the United States. I think part of the reason is because in Canada there is more government public support for immigrant integration. So money is given to community-based organizations to help with the integration experience. This can help especially less educated, low-income immigrants acquire sort of the skills they need in order to apply for citizenship. I think there's more of a discourse to welcome people to citizenship. In Canada, there's very much a sense that immigration is part of nation building. In the United States, as we can see in the current political debates around the presidency, there are people in the Republican Party who question whether immigrants should be living in the United States, want to deport them, call them names. And so, that's not particularly a very welcoming message. So in Canada, you have lots of immigrants, more than 20% of the population. They become citizens at very high levels. Up to 80 to 90% of immigrants who have lived in Canada for at least 10 years become Canadian citizens. In the United States, the sort of comparable statistic for people who are eligible to become a citizen is somewhere between 50 to 60. So you just have a vastly higher proportion of people who are immigrant citizens and therefore voters. And then in Canada, too, elections are much more competitive. And so you have immigrants who are concentrated in what's called ridings in Canada, so not districts, but ridings. And they are in ridings that matter. They are in ridings in most of the major cities, and what they vote can swing an election. And so political parties go after those votes. and therefore they get brought into politics. So just like what we were talking about, that there's an invitation to join politics because their votes matter and their numbers are significant, much more than in the United States, where immigrants tend to concentrate in places where there is much more incumbency and it's much less competitive.
Yeah, we were talking before we started recording. When I lived in Canada for a period of time, one of the things that struck me watching Canadian elections in the United States, you listen to political pundits and political scientists and pollsters, and they will break down the electorate into, as you said, female vote and male vote, rural voters, urban voters, but then racial lines, the Black voters, the Latino vote, the Asian vote. In Canada, it's much more immigrant specific. So it's the Indian Canadian vote, it's the Chinese Canadian vote, it's the African Canadian vote in particular, but nationality based much more so. Um, do you see that? Is that your? I mean, that was an observation of mine, but does your research sort of bear that out? And does that diffuse those votes, voting groups more so when they're sort of in smaller nationality based voting groups, or do you think that it does invite further participation?
So I think here the difference between that first generation and second and third generation is really important. I agree with what you said, that in the United States, the way we talk about politics, whether in the public or whether in our academic research, tends to be focused on these racial groups. And for someone like myself, who's an immigration scholar, that's problematic, because if you talk about the Latino vote, you're talking about a group of voters where, say, about a third of them might be foreign born, but two-thirds are not. Two-thirds of Latino voters are born in the United States. Some of them have been in the US for 6, 7 generations. The border moved across them. It's not that they
Hmm.
moved across a border. And so the diversity in terms of their experience and the degree to which they're linked to immigration is very different. Asian Americans in the United States, about two-thirds of them are foreign born. And so when we talk about Asian Americans for the first generation, if someone is from India, they're going to have a very hard time understanding why they might be a voting bloc of Asians compared to someone from Taiwan, compared to someone from Iran. Like, that is
Hmm.
all
Yeah.
geographically in Asia. But for an Indian immigrant, like, say, someone who's Hindu, they're going to be like, okay, there's the Iranian who has a different religion, different language, looks different from me. And here's this person from, say, Taiwan, again, different religious tradition, different language. The concept of Asian American doesn't make much sense to the first generation. And so that can be problematic for mobilization, because if politicians or advocacy groups are trying to increase the Asian American participation rate, it really might need to be in a particular language, in a particular religious community, in a particular civic organization. However, the second generation, they are further away from their parents' homeland. English is likely their dominant and first language. They can see potentially more benefits for those solidarities and coalitions. And so in the Canadian case, yes, those appeals to the Punjabi community, to the Sikh community, to the Chinese Canadian community can be very effective, because you have an entire ethnic media structure, you have particular areas where people might congregate, and so you can really mobilize people along those lines. What will be interesting to see is, in 2, 3 generations, whether those things shake out differently, what kind of coalitions might arise.
Yeah. So before we wrap up here, are there any last thoughts you have on trends on how immigrants are participating civically, and what the challenges and opportunities you see are for those in the United States? And we can talk about Canada well, but let's focus first. We have election coming up here in the U.S. What do you see kind of moving forward?
So I worry that the current political rhetoric that seems to blame immigrants for so many things is going to create probably two tendencies. One is going to be, there's going to be a small group of advocates who are going to become really vocal and defend their communities, whether it's an ethnic or religious or racial community. And I think that's all to the good. It's in a spirit of social movement activism that has been in the United States for over a century. But what I really worry about is that the majority of immigrants are going to be just scared. They are going to be worried about hate crimes. They're going to be worried about deportation, even if they are citizens. We know that in the past, when there have been mass deportations, citizens have been caught up in those mass deportations. And so I think it's going to drive a group of people to silence at a moment where potentially our democracy is under threat, and we need people to speak out. So I am worried about that. I think immigrants have taken to the streets when they've had to. So you might remember, and some of the listeners might remember, back in 2005 and 2006, when we had, literally millions of immigrants taking to the streets in order to oppose making undocumented status a felony. So there's a potential there. But I think the current moment is so sort of anti-immigrant, and that's going to hurt the U.S. in so many ways, because if we look at economic vitality, if we look at new patents, if we look at places that have been revitalized in terms of our housing stock, it's very often the immigrants who help those things along. So I really, really worry about that.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen, I think, over the last, 30, 40 years, lots of pendulum swings when it comes to immigration. And we're definitely in one of those. I mean, even you go back a century in the United States, 1924 was probably the most restrictive immigration law that we had passed in a very long time. And maybe we're going through one of those, sort of moments again where we're going to see pendulum swings. But we've come through them. And I personally am a hopeful person. And I like to think that, as someone who, like you, believes that immigration can and should be good for the United States, we have to kind of come back to, how do we do this better? If we don't like what's happening now, how do we do it better? And we'll see. I mean, folks will listen to this probably on or after Election Day. So when they listen, they may know who has won the White House and who has won Congress, and we'll see what the next 4 years brings. But Irene Bloemraad, thank you so much for joining us from Montreal today on This Week in Immigration.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find our podcast episodes on the Bipartisan Policy Center YouTube channel. You can find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown, and you can follow me at Jack Malday. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malday. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself, Rennie Mockery, and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.